Hi, I'm IKEA, and for today's video I'm going to ramble on for a while about the PTS that has been instituted for Project Resolve, which is the big health update that they've announced quite recently with a live stream and some trailers around it. It is especially about the health of the game. This isn't a PTS for the new season, which means that it doesn't actually contain any new gear, any new exotics, any new brand sets, any new gear sets, or names, or anything like that. That's not part of this PTS. There will be a separate PTS for next season's gear and exotics and stuff like that. This one is very much about Project Resolve, and Project Resolve is at its core what they have announced it as being about the health of the game, mostly about performance and stability for a large part, and also about balance. And they have rebalanced quite a bit of things, and we'll go into those stuffs and talk about them. I've prepared a lot of things in recent streams. We've gone over all the changes that they've done to the weapons, a bunch of the talent changes and their wording and what they kind of mean in effect. We'll go through all of that. We'll start out with the patch notes, and I'll link everything down below, including all of my work. The patch notes will be coming from Trello. I'll link Trello, and there are two separate patch notes lists, as one of them is PvE, or stated as being PvE changes, the other as PvP changes. Both of them basically contain things that apply to both, which is a little bit weird. They should have just made one big one. And of course, we'll go through some of my work, and I'll also link all of those spreadsheets down below. So yeah, let's press to start and continue on into this. And to start off, we'll very quickly go through the patch notes, as I'm re-recording this as I took way too long. We are gonna look at, there are two patch notes lists. There's one for PvE, one for PvP. There's a lot of changes. We won't hit all of them. What I'll say as well is that, yeah, in this, the tinkering menu isn't here, which is one of the big changes. There is some quality of life changes, a lot of them. I will link everything down below. You can read them at your leisure. But yeah, there are some health changes, which will be very beneficial to reducing, especially very high-level players' ability to cheese their health. There's changes to the scaling of open world chests, which I'll just briefly say I'm not completely for. I feel it will really alter the flow of open world, and I'm actually against this change, but also it's not a hill I'm willing to die on, so we'll leave it as is. But yeah, I don't like this. This will, what it is that open world loot crates will scale to this world scale, or to the world setting. So chests in the open world will drop heroic loot when you have your world set to heroic. I think that that is a bad change, but it's been lauded by many people, but I just wanted my opinion to be out on them. There is some changes to especially optimization and recalibration, especially to recalibration optimization costs. There's also now the ability that they're adding with tinkering to alter gear within your inventory, even while not being at the White House, which is a welcome change. It isn't available in this PTS, so we haven't had the ability to test it. But the way they explained it, it basically gives you all of the options that you have at the recalibration station just out in the world, including as they said it, I believe they said it, to donating all of the junk for expertise and proficiency. So that's kind of good. There's also now an armor kit. When you double tap, you get, you use up an armor kit and you heal 25%. This is actually a cool ability and will come in handy from time to time. Those moments when you have, you're on fire or you're bleeding, you're gonna go down from it. It's gonna hit your health gate, and it's gonna take a little longer than your health gate, and you'll go down from it. Instead, now you have the ability to hit that health kit, to hit that armor kit, get some armor back, and that's usually actually enough to make that survivable. So it's actually quite useful. Another bad change is very much, I would say, the gear combat lock, which means that in combat, currently we can't alter loadouts. With this new version, we also can't swap out gear or weapons or grenades. You still can't swap out skills while in combat, but no gear, no weapons, which is just clunky and just feels just annoying. It's a thing we were able to do, sometimes just swapping weapons quickly during combat. Of course, this is to go against chest swapping in PvP and the busy little bee hot swapping that gets done for in PvE, where it gets used for one-shotting, but this is a little bit too drastic, and I would be surprised if this actually makes it in the game, as is with the backlash that currently exists on it. Because, of course, all of these are subject to change. Expertise is getting a lot of reductions, and that's a good thing. Over time, costs of these kinds of things should be reduced to make it easier on newer players and older players. We have benefited from having these high expertises on weapons till now, and then now everybody else gets to catch up. And they get to do it as a reduced cost. And yeah, especially exotic materials are going to 42 to get from level 11 to level 24, where now it's 135, because especially those last 4 levels cost you 80. Here, even less than that, 42 is taking you all the way from 11 to 24. And of course, we'll be having 25 when the new season hits, most likely. That's how it's worked for every season so far, where when we go into a new season, we get 1 more expertise level. As well, SHD recalibrations is getting reduced by a lot as well, which is kind of my bottleneck currently, because I have enough exotic components, but I don't have watch alts on my main account. On my other accounts, I do, of course, and there's no problem. I just burn through watch alts to get all of the resources I need. But especially on my main account, I'm finding SHD calibrations to actually be my bottleneck, and this will be my reduction that will help a lot. Projects, we won't go into all of them, but all of the projects are kind of getting touched. Big changes are especially that in a lot of places you're getting more XP, more caches from everything. Places where you were getting a named item, for instance, the SHD requisition of the weekly, instead now we're getting a named item cache, which is a welcome change, because the named item caches, of course, also include all of the DZ items, so you're getting more of those from those. Everything's getting crafting blueprints, including just the dailies, which didn't have it before. And that means that more easily you have an extra source for crafting blueprints. And the summit one, both with getting more items, and also, for instance, getting 2 named item caches where you just got 1 named in the past, is getting reduced to 15 levels, which is a welcome change. Then we go into weapon balancing. We'll hit on these actually in depth in a second, where we'll go into a burst and sustain table that have altered to be with these new changes, and not just their stated changes as they have them here, but actually what they are in the game. Because sometimes there's difference between what they state and what is in game. Not many here, actually, I will say. Not as much as, for instance, have been in the past or with the last long ago. Weapon rebalancing around 210, whenever they did that. To go into it in large strokes, ARs are getting rebalanced. All of these weapons that are basically listed here are getting taken from from the middle of the pack all the way to just underneath the top. And especially the F2000 is getting special treatment and is going basically to the top. Every weapon that isn't listed here, and we'll kind of go into that when we reach the burst and sustain tables, is getting left behind. Something like a FAMAS, of course, is already at the top, as is now just, going into the pack. But especially some of the weapons like SIG or AUG or AKMs that aren't listed here and don't have any changes to them are actually falling behind by a lot. So it's actually creating a larger gap, really. Same kind of with SMGs, as we'll also go in depth into them, but especially, the Banshee is getting a little bit of a buff. But of course, the king of this category is the Ouroboros, and actually the king of all categories. Nothing, I will say here, nothing really increases enough to really change that supremacy. In ARs, we're getting a bunch of weapons that will go in there and compete with the FAMAS and the Elmo as they are currently. But in SMGs, of course, we have the Ouroboros. But for instance, the CMMG Banshee, as is here, is going to the top here. We'll come back to light machine guns in a second, because I want to rant about them for a little bit. We'll go into rifles. They're getting kind of the same treatment, although some of the numbers are a little bit big. In 30% weapon damage, that's a lot. That's a lot. Like, really, we're putting 30% on stuff. And of course, our marksman rifles as well. We won't actually go into burst and sustains of marksman rifles, because that's not what they do. They don't burst or sustain. They don't do DPS, really. They're much more about their base weapon damage. I will say here the M700s have risen to the top, very much so. So they likely will displace, if this changes gets applied as is, they'll displace the white debt. I feel quite strongly that will happen. I feel this kind of feels like change just for the sake of change, which I don't know how to feel about, but also it really doesn't matter if one other thing is at the top. I actually would be happy using a M700 carbon with determined instead. Let's go back to LMGs, where the entire class, except the Iron Lung, because that one was in burst and sustained DPS was already a little bit ahead. Of course, its magazine size hurts it. But the entire class is moving up by 20%. Every weapon in there is getting basically plus 20%, although we'll see that that's not completely true, although it's also in the known issues that I know already that's not completely true. Moving up an entire class by 20% is, first of all, too much. They've actually jumped over ARs and are, if this change goes in as is, the new meta, which is kind of the bad thing as well, because they suppress quite a bit, and that means that, especially in teams, in experienced teams, it will just lead to frustration. In experienced teams, this is just more damage, although not more damage than Ouroboros, which experienced teams were already using, and it's lazy. When you are going through the lengths in ARs, balancing everything kind of like this, even though, to me, actually, you're not doing the best job. It is a little bit out of whack with some of the changes. Although moving most of the things up, at least they didn't buff the FAMAS, for instance, or the TKB, which were quite high in their burst and sustain categories and stuff. Just moving the entire category up by 20% means that in that category, you are not rebalancing it. And especially the LMGs could really use a rebalancing. The Stoner should not be as low as it is, especially with the GR9, which just is outcompetes it by so much. This needs to be balancing within the class and as a class at most plus 10%, because currently it's too much. That is very much my opinion on it, and I like LMGs, so I wouldn't mind even that if they are the new meta, but also what you really need to change is suppression mechanics, because suppression mechanics is actually the reason why LMGs don't find much use. You would be much better off leaving them at their own damage that they were, and then just, not removing the suppression mechanic, because it is an inherent mechanic to the game, but just reducing how much suppression applies to LMGs. Let's move on. Carbine 7 and Stoner LMG will no longer drop with a fixed talent. That is an important one. Gear balancing, I'll be brief about this. Not really much changes. There is, you can go to the list, of course, it will be linked, so you can just look at it at your leisure. The only ones I'll point out here is that especially this armor regen on 2-piece Golan and 3-piece Gila doesn't seem balanced and is a way too easy way to get 6% regen, which is way too much regen, especially with the current meta in PvP. I'm not very much a PvP player, but even I can see the issue here, basically. So most of the other changes aren't really effective because they're mostly to 3 pieces and 2 pieces, and most of those bonuses we don't really care about, especially because it's mostly to blue gear, yellow gear. The only one in yellow gear that I'll point out here is that Empress and Hanayu at their 2-piece, where they have 10 skill damage, are going to 20 skill damage. So third drone builds that are built around Empress and Hanayu and Wyvern, they'll get basically from these two brand bonuses, they'll get an extra 20 skill damage, which is a little buff to them. Not much else here matters, and especially on the reds, they haven't really touched anything. And to me, that is actually a good thing. They could have messed up pretty bad here by trying to get these numbers much larger, and especially trying to get the ninja bike going kind of with red builds. The thing is that also that would apply to usage in the current meta builds, which is stuff like strikers and such. One thing to point out here, though, is that Grupo is going from 15 to 20 skill explosive damage, which is a tiny buff to explosive builds, but also they didn't really need it. But the gear changes are, I don't think it will change really anything. Some people might find some interesting uses, some maybe with repair and such, but also, yeah, not particularly important changes. Descent is getting quite alteration from going from Nemesis being able to be reached at the end of loop 4. So now currently you would have to reach loop 5 and finish it, and then you could go to the Nemesis if you did your best to do so by taking the easiest rooms. Now that will be reduced to 4, and that just means that you can do more Nemesis runs, basically. The other big change that they're planning, and I'm hoping this one doesn't go through, which is that they want to do talent pool rotations. And what they mean with that is that there will be fixed pools. They'll set them, the devs will set them, they will rotate on a weekly basis as they're planning here. And it will be 35 talents and 6 exotics. And the devs are not, it's not a random system, they're trying to make it thematic and such. The downside of this is when you want to do deep runs, you have to now kind of go like, okay, when are they planning good talents? When do I do the deep runs? Because especially on deeper runs going past loop 25, you can very much make a build, even with the current system as is now, because you can re-roll quite a bit after loop 20. You'll run out of things to buy, and you'll have close to infinite re-roll ability, meaning that for deep runs, this is actually a nerf. And I hope they just don't do this, basically. Or they have to kind of put it with a system where you can like kind of pick 10 favorite talents maybe or something, and they will always be in the pool, so that like the player has a choice that they do want this set of talents to be in the pool always. Otherwise, it's going to suck when there are weeks when they're chosen the team, and the team is you don't do damage, or the team is you have to use skill builds. And that will kind of be annoying in there. And I don't think it is a really good change. I'd rather have the current system than what they're planning here. Another change to Descent is, they're giving us something to buy with NSA, which is that we can buy exotic and named caches. I was hoping for reconstructed caches here as well, maybe even at a really high cost, but they didn't give that option, but maybe we can still convince them to do so. There aren't really any changes to Countdown or Summit, except that the Summit level 100 XP glitch has been fixed. And they have fixed the corner glitch. What they mean by this is that the corner peeking with the shield, with the scoping in, and being basically in cover while being able to shoot around it. They fixed it by changing the zoom in point. So normally it would go to the center of the screen, now it actually goes to your scope. So it means that you're now scoping into the wall. This hurts some stuff, hurts solo speedruns, for instance, as they use that quite heavily. But I'm quite fine with it. I'm surprised more that they fixed this after all this time. One other change that they haven't actually specifically told anywhere, I feel, is that flashbangs now go to, when you get flashbanged, your screen doesn't turn white and burn your eyes out. It goes actually to black, which is much more, you're still blind, you still don't see anything, but at least you're not blind in real life afterwards, which is a very welcome change. Although I could see some people wanting it still to be a toggle, which it isn't. You don't have the option at the current time, it's just how that works. Because some people might still hate their retinas and may want them burned out. Let's move on to the PvP ones. And to continue on with the PvP ones, will be a lot shorter here because we'll only really hit the talents, as those are parts of the PvP improvements, even though really they affect both. There are a lot of changes to rogue status, the status effects especially. You can read through them at your own leisure if you want to. They're mostly affecting, of course, DZ and PvP. Not my area of expertise or really what I care about, so I'm fine with skipping all those. We'll go to the talents, and especially all the talents that aren't listed as PvP only do affect, of course, as well PvE, meaning. So one of the big changes, and I just expect this to not go into the game as is Dr. Home. They've changed it to target killed to being target headshotted. This breaks a lot of stuff because instead of it's not only the player target headshotting. Of course, this old one was target killed from any source, so all your allies. This one is still also all your allies, meaning that once you proc it on an enemy, any ally that is also headshotting it is causing that Dr. Home heal. And imagine, for instance, right, where the healer just procs it on an or raid boss or anything like that, procs it on them, everybody's headshotting them, or even in Countdown, for instance, of course, everybody's headshotting them. The amounts of heals going around is insane. This shouldn't go into the game as is, but that's what PTSs are for. Future perfection, which is the perfect future perfect, is getting a change, going from 3 to 4, and this will actually give 4 skill tiers, meaning that you can go from 2 skill tiers all the way to 6, and then also, of course, at 6, the next skill then will overcharge you, which means that if you have Technician and Memento, for instance, that you can go all the way to 6 skill tiers and then overcharge with just the weapon. The downside of this, as we'll see in the weapon, the burst tables in a second, is that the SIG did not get a buff and is kind of getting left behind. So that's somewhat of a balancing factor for it. But this is actually an interesting change, and I'm curious to see what we find to do with this, because yeah, there is some ideas here that we can use. A bunch of other stuff is getting changed. We won't hit on them, but Swift of the Stinger is getting an increase. That doesn't matter because its big problem isn't that it's not restacking. Thunderstrike is going to be in the same vein as all of the other status effect ones. It's no longer a humongous amount, but you don't get to apply it after a few kills. It just goes to the same values as the other ones, and you get to apply it after a few kills. The Bighorn is getting a change. The Big Game Hunter is its talent. It's getting actually that it's stacking up its talent a lot faster. So instead of 2% 50 times, it's 4% 25 times. The same amount, you're just getting there faster. And this buff is actually pretty decent, but it's still not enough for, in my opinion, to make the Bighorn really an all-round weapon. Lady Death is getting that it's equal to max size, and this is quite an interesting change and may lead to people trying some stuff out, but I don't think it will really make a difference. We'll hit Perfect Preservation here at the end first, and this is a little bit of an increase, and yeah, we'll help that little P90 to be a little bit more useful and give it a little bit more personal identity, and might actually be... I already kind of like it in Hunter's Furies, and this extra amount might actually make me actually really like it. We'll go on to Flatline, and Flatline, they changed the wording here. So the current wording is amplifies weapon damage by 20 or 15% for the high-end one. They changed this wording weirdly to deals 15 weapon damage. That led a lot of us to believe that Flatline was getting a nerf, just reading this. Because yeah, it reads as if it's going from the amp that it is to a 15% weapon damage. But that's actually not the case. It is an amp still. We'll go actually into the calculations that prove that. The actual change is this 3 kills going to 4 kills, meaning you need 1 more kill, but this is not the thing anybody cared about anyway. So it's not really a change. I'm guessing Flatline is popular. They're trying to give it somewhat of a nerf, but this is not the place to nerf it. The kills part isn't really what matters. We're using Impulse anyway. Moving on to gear talents, Intimidate got a big change and actually makes it quite useful. If it goes in as its current state, it might actually be overpowered, I would almost say. One thing I will say is that if you will run into issues if you actually try to use the number that they're stating here of 4%, it's 5%. The alteration is instead of going from 1 stack to 1 stack per second, and then a max of 7, it's 3 stacks per second, up to a max of 9 stacks. They're likely intended to be 4%. It isn't. It's 5% in-game currently. And that's kind of messing some people up with their calculations, including me, until we just tried some stuff out and I went, wait, the old one is 5%, let's try that, and that matched up. And yeah, 9 stacks of 5%, and this is still self-multiplicative, the way that Intimidate currently is, and it stacks up in 3 seconds with 3 stacks of per second up to 9. And that's quite a big number, which is 55% amp combined altogether for 3 seconds. And that's kind of a lot. Although, of course, you still have this limitation of within 10 meters. We actually have a place where I have tried it out with the build, and we'll talk about it a little bit more. The Foundry Bulwarks is getting some changes, and yeah, it's getting stronger. So will it make it worthwhile, especially the chest and backpack talents? I mean, Foundry Bulwark already only really finds work in Iron Horse. it really didn't need a buff for there. Will it be more worthwhile outside of it? Not really, because it's a blue build, and why would be? Obliterated is getting a buff, weirdly. It was 5 seconds before it drops off. Now it will become 10 seconds before it drops off, which is very noticeable. This a lot of times when it was dropping off, instead now you can actually carry it on into the next skill. And that is quite a big buff to Obliterate, which is weird because Obliterate is already pretty, yeah, it's one of the meta talents. Unbreakable and Perfect Unbreakable changes are only PvP, and I don't think this will really alter anything in PvP. It is a little less, with 10% less and 5% less, but also there is still nothing else that really competes with them. Link Laser Pointer is getting reduced from 20 seconds to 6 seconds, and this also really doesn't change much. You will notice it, especially if you're running Pulse nowadays. You'll notice that you'll lose enemies faster, but it's not really that big of a change because you're always ADSing anyway for the points when you're using Spotter or using Flatline. And yeah, then there's a bunch of known issues that they've listed down here as well. Let's jump over to the burst and sustain tables that I've prepared, and we'll go through a little in depth the weapon changes. And for those weapon changes, I've taken the time. We did it on stream, which was very helpful because people helped me find the errors as I was making them, or the errors that I made afterwards and pointing them out pretty quickly. We took the burst and sustain table that I always have in the burst and sustain, the main file that has all of them. We made a copy of it, which is the one down there. And it will be up and of course linked, and you can have a go look at for yourself as well at your own leisure, because we'll go through this pretty fast just to, you know, not make this hours and hours long. Let's jump into the file as is, and everything that is marked green has had a change at that stat. So this is quite handy to kind of see what the changes are. And actually, if we look at the burst of ARs, and we'll start with ARs, of course, as they're the most popular category, we see that a bunch of stuff has moved up here, and all of them have green. So basically everything that got a buff moved up quite a bit, which, I mean, of course it did, as nothing else was kind of nerfed or pushed down. And that means that the F2000 is kind of at the top now, and it's very much so at the top. It's at its current stats, which I would hope actually that it doesn't go into the game with its current stats. I would hope it was either take the RPM buff or take the magazine size buff, not both. It seems a little bit much. Although I'm perfectly fine with having a new top dog to replace the FAMAS with, but I'll just replace the FAMAS with that. And it very much feels like change for the sake of change. A lot of the other weapons that got buffed are now just below the FAMAS, the G36, the FAL, the ACR, the P416. The TKB didn't get a buff, so it got moved a bit down in the pack. It used to be just behind the FAMAS. And then, yeah, the Honey Badger, the Mark 16, and then the M4. So the M4 is still, was one of the top-end weapons, together with the Carbine 7 and the FAMAS were the 3 most recommended weapons usually. The M4 and the Carbine 7 especially, not having gotten buffs, have been moved down this pack and have been moved behind weapons that just flat out will replace them. So especially if you were running an M4, if these changes go through as are, and I hope they don't, I hope they buff basically all weapons a little bit, because M4 and Carbine 7 can use a little bit of a buff if they have to compete with other weapons in here. Because why would you use an M4 all the way down here in the burst, and especially as well, it's not that they're doing so much better in the sustain, because in the sustain, the Carbine 7 and the M4 are all the way at the end anyway. So they're bad sustainers, bad bursters. The top end is lower, their low end is lower. Why would you not grab a G36 or FAL, or, well, not a FAL per se, but ACR or G36 specifically, or P416 even? Leaving weapons behind, especially, for instance, the M4 and the Carbine 7 in this existence, yeah, they will, it's, to me, just change for the sake of change, really. So keep those in the pack, give them 5%ers or something, keep them in this pack. And then especially as well, the thing that I would definitely say they need to do is they forgot the AKM, the SIG, well, all the AKM, so the Of course, there's one with 3 mods, there's one with 4 mods, and then the PDR and the AUG. And unsurprisingly, all of those were middle of the pack weapons, middle to the end of the pack weapons, and everything else has been moved up, and they're just left behind. They have no purpose really now. If your intention is to try to give every weapon viability, which is kind of what their stated goal is here, don't forget about these. Bring these up as well. What I would love is, because they've left basically the end of the pack kind of the same. They've moved, actually, well, the M6 or the Mark 16 used to be the end of the pack here. They've moved, given that one above, it's moved up, but they've actually increased the range in between these. And I would feel that really all of these weapons should be in this area that I've highlighted there, of just being around a difference of around 9% at most. So bring all of these other weapons, give them buffs as well, and just bring them into the pack. Make this pack smaller, make every weapon kind of viable in their own way. As well, give the TKB as well still a buff. The FAMAS is fine without a buff. It's actually, I mean, it was outlier, so now it's kind of in the pack. The TKB is not of the same kind, because actually what is happening here, it has 650 RPM, ACR has 650 RPM. The base weapon damage is 58.7. The ACRs is 59.3. So it's just worse than the ACR, really, because also in accuracy and stability it was already behind. So it should have more damage than the ACR, I feel, because it's a worse handling weapon. Now it's basically just being pushed out of the pack, really, in effect. So yeah, just bring everything within 7% or something of each other. Still keep weapons that, for instance, like the TKB, like the AKMs and such, give them a little bit higher burst than the rest, just so they can compete, because they will always kind of lose a little bit of their perceived burst because of just the accuracy issues that they have. And sustain is kind of the same story. A lot of green at the top, especially, of course, the F2000, very much so. One thing I want to point out as well here that a lot of people are jumping on is that, yeah, the burst of the F2000 is a lot higher. We'll actually put it on a build because, see, looking at it here, it seems just flat out the new king. The thing is that it, of course, has one less mod slot, and especially with the meta builds currently, which is Striker, you kind of need crit chance everywhere that you can get it, especially with a high-end weapon. So we'll go into actually build, and there I will give the spoiler already. The F2000 and FAMAS kind of line up at the same spot burst-wise, and then of course the F2000 kind of out-sustains it, and that is the reason that I would likely say pick one of these two and just, or make both of them 5, make it a 5% RPM increase or a 25% or 25 point RPM increase, going, you know, to 875 and then plus 5 to its mag. Having both kind of actually does make it somewhat the new king, which I'm okay with, but it just seems a little bit arbitrary. One other one, of course, that has been changed is the Eagle Bearer. Eagle Bearer and Elmo are now basically competing for the same position in the Exotics one. Of course, Eagle Bearer comes with Tenacity, but Tenacity is not just a pro, it's also a con. It will get you killed from time to time, and the Elmo won't, quite easily. That's basically the thing there. Well, I have actually calculated that, and we'll go into a chart where we're going to compare them on build, because of course, the Eagle Bearer comes with 10 crit chance, 15 crit damage, the Elmo comes with 20 crit chance, 20 crit damage. So it has a lot more, 10 more crit chance, 5 more crit damage, and then differing talents. So it isn't as easy as just looking at DPS charts. You have to kind of compare them on builds, but luckily for you guys, I've done that. We'll go to SMGs. On SMGs, as we also will start on burst, the MPX is the big loser here. It didn't get a buff. The Banshee did and is jumping way high above it. The Banshee is the new king kind of in here. A lot of the other weapons as well have become viable. I should say actually as well in the ARs, a lot of the Mark 16, the P416, the ACR, the G36 all have become viable and very usable, I think. And especially for use, for instance, because of course the two new, well, the F2000 and the FAMAS both being the top dogs in that category, both of them can take long rails. So if you want flatline, now like you're looking at either a G36 or ACR most likely. for uses in that. The Banshee here has gotten a buff. The MPX didn't. They were basically the two top dogs in this category. Now it's just the Banshee. A lot of other weapons got buffed, but actually in this category we see that even with large buffs, the T82 ones still are at the bottom of the barrel here. Of course, they do a little better on sustain, but yeah, not enough to be worth it at the cost of their burst. None of the SMG exotics got altered, although of course, one thing that does reflect on them, as actually I think now that I didn't touch on it in the patch notes, is that all of the exotics now can reroll the third attribute, which is a very, very, very big change. Meaning that where Ouroboros, of course, already could have detalk, and we would want to have detalk on it, all of the other ones, because all three here did not have the damage to targets out of cover as their third stat, now they can. Meaning they all are getting a buff, basically, to their effectiveness. But yeah, no actual buffs on their stats. And that's kind of happening here as well with the weapons that didn't get buffed. So for instance, the P90 or the PP19s or the MPX are getting kind of falling out of the pack. And yeah, I would feel just give everything a buff. And also, again, here, make the range smaller. Make it, instead of how large of a range it is here with its like almost, well, more than 20%. Instead of that, make this into 15% max. Maybe starting, or make it 10% max starting at the Banshee, because of course the attack vector and the vectors really do need to be a little bit above the rest because they have other issues in their damage per mac. Let's move on to rifles first. We'll round back to SMGs, and of course this sheet will be linked down below, so you can go a little bit more in depth. I'm going pretty fast here, mostly to not make this take hours. Here, the big ones that have been left out from buffs are the M1A CQB, the classic M1A, and the 1886. The 1886, of course, didn't really need a buff anyway. It's getting used in different ways than the rest, mostly for its base weapon damage. The classic M1A not getting a buff, especially when everything around it is getting at least a 10%, has moved it really far down the bottom here. But the M1A CQB was already such an outlier that still nothing caught up to it, really. And even the jump to the next one is at least 10%. So it is still the king of that category, but of course it comes at a cost of a very, very low max size. Meaning that, yeah, something like ACRSS, actually, if you're using it at that RPM, which I, for instance, quite often am, is going to work out pretty well. The one standard I will put forward here is the Mark 17. It's been moved up quite a bit. It was already a decent performer in this category, and it has a rate of fire that is low enough that you can kind of use it, because the classic M1A is, of course, 3 clicks per second with 180 RPM. This is 275. 5 clicks would be 300 RPM, so it's just below 5 clicks a second, which is very, very much a manageable thing to achieve. And because of that, I think the Mark 17 is actually going to... this is the one I would recommend, kind of. Another one actually that kind of is getting quite a big buff, because plus 30% is a lot, is the M16A2. It of course has 1 mod less, so it is getting 5 crit chance less. But you actually just click. Whenever you click, you're getting 3 rounds out, so you actually have a very low rate of fire, so you can click a lot less. Although of course you got to learn to recoil compensate for that weapon, which is a challenge, I feel, as someone who is more used to recoil controlling for something where you just hold down the button and you just go. But you can learn it. I've gotten decent at it through the ages, but yeah, this numbers wise kind of almost makes sense. Not quite completely though. Of course, in this category as well, the only one, because we only have it down here actually, because I remembered now that I didn't alter them all, is the Ravenous and the, especially, well, the Ravenous and the Merciless got buffs. The Ravenous getting currently a buff of around, actually I need to lean in it for a second, around 10%, means that it is getting very powerful, and they intend a 25% buff. The Ravenous does not need the 25% buff. And that, yeah, that is a big buff, and people are breaking the game with the Ravenous already. That one might not be needed. Let's leave that at home. Here, actually, just to point out, the ones that are with blue highlights behind, or the cell is blue behind the name, those are with the big mags, and then the gray ones are just the normal size mag. So you're, for instance, taking stability or something on the mag slot, and then of course, for the sustain, more mag size means more output. And yeah, especially on the sustain, especially looking at burst and sustain together, ACR SS kind of rises to the top, Mark 17 kind of rises to the top. Because, of course, as well, the M1A CQB, while it is a really, really good weapon, on sustain, it just falls way behind. So when the burst is close enough to each other, but they differ in sustain by this much, I would pick that Mark 17, very much so. Let's go back to the one that we skipped, LMGs. In the LMG category, everything's getting a buff. You get a buff, you get a buff, you get a buff, and you get a buff. Too much buffs. Also, too much of a number. One thing to actually say, because I only have it on this one, on the mag one, because I was lazy. This chart at the these numbers at the right side here, they are my calculation. So I basically didn't trust their number or just take the base number and add whatever they said they were adding. I actually went into the game, had a build with 100 weapon damage towards that class. Then we took the in-game stat, meaning that we took it just from the stat sheet, not from the weapon. We had 100 weapon damage, so we just half the number. That's why having 100 weapon damage is so nice for that. And then we also had the old number here, and we're percentaging it difference here. Now, of course, on LMGs, most of them are close enough to be called 20%. Some of the other ones, not so much, and some of them are a little bit off. For instance, especially the ACR. Instead of the stated 10%, it's 11% and a little bit, so that's a little bit weird. Also, going back to the rifles for a second, because I forgot to say this, these two red ones, the two weapons that have red here, the LVOC and the lightweight M4 as they are here, these two weren't listed changes, and they do have changes to them, because I have all the weapons in game, so I had the opportunity to check against the base weapons as listed in, or as against the base weapons as you toggle them on. Even though they're truncated there, you can see that like they did something to them because they don't line up with the old numbers. So yeah, those are those two red ones. That's just unlisted changes. Let's go back to LMGs again. This is too big of a buff. If you just look at the, especially for instance, the, as we are on mag damage there, let's go back to burst, of course. If we take the RPK and we take its 720 burst there, and we put that against ARs now, even the best AR is 60k behind. That is not okay. LMGs shouldn't be that far ahead, especially because LMGs should actually be a little bit behind ARs, even though, of course, ARs have a very big buff because of their 21 health. There is plenty of places where that 21 health isn't that useful, and this will push LMGs to the top, and LMGs aren't great for all-round weapons because they suppress so much. So people will start using them for this burst or for this high burst, and they will just suppress way too much. Because in coordinated teams, you can bypass the suppression mechanics a lot by having a foam eclipse in there or a fire eclipse, setting everything on fire or foaming them. This is too big of a buff, and also, again, lazy, because within this category, the Stoner could use a buff. The GR9 could actually kind of use a buff. The Negev could use a little bit of a buff. Same for the M249 / Mark 46s. Even actually the L86 could use a magazine size increase a little bit. Even though it's high on burst here, it just falls behind on sustain just because of that tiny magazine size. You should balance within the class as well. We need balance within this class, and then also the class needs to, it needs a little bit of a buff, but mostly it needs just its suppression mechanics changed, because per bullet, LMGs seem to suppress an enemy more per bullet fired close to them than ARs. That is a straight up testable thing. Remove that. Just remove that effect, make them all the same suppression amount, and LMGs will find quite a bit of favor at that point, and they don't need this big of a damage increase. Honestly, they didn't really need a damage increase, but now that you're moving ARs quite a bit up, the general ARs, they can use a little bit of a buff, but not this much. I'll point out here as well that actually, yeah, the exotics, of course, have gotten their buffs as well, although actually, as is listed in the known issues, it's not all by the 20%. Actually, only the Bullet King is getting that 20% currently in there. The Pestilence is not getting a buff at all. That doesn't seem to be their intention in the end, but that's currently what is happening there. 20% to this whole class is a bit much. And I would hope they reconsider. Okay, we went through all of these bursts. Let's actually jump into this next one, which will discuss in depth the F2000 versus all of the other ARs, especially discussing most of the ARs. As we are moving to a multi-calculator, and that means we're going to compare some stuff. And the thing we're comparing here is starting out, as I'll link these down below as well, of course, so you can check them out for yourself. These are multi-calculators of my design. We're inputting in the yellow areas down here. We're getting output up here. We're comparing things together. Here we're comparing first the FAMAS versus the F2000 on an actual build. Because, of course, the F2000 has one crit chance mod less on itself. So we need to compensate for that on the gear, meaning that we end up with less crit damage because we're flipping a crit damage mod basically to a crit chance mod on as this is here, Obliterate Striker. So we're taking the 100 static Striker with Obliterate, and its crit chance, crit damages as it currently is in the game. We'll add Coyote in later. Looking at that point, we see actually that the F2000 barely loses out on burst. And this is one of those places where if you're only looking at burst, you would go at this and go, okay, the FAMAS is fine, kind of, right? Like it's a percentage less for the F2000. But then on sustain, the F2000, of course, because max size and reload, which are both low, well, the max size is higher, the reload is lower for the F2000. They don't factor into burst at all. It's just RPM and their base damage. Here we see that the sustain of the F2000 is quite a bit higher, 8% higher, meaning that this tiny amount of difference here in the burst gets completely negated by the sustain here, meaning that after even likely 2 mags, the F2000 is going to be ahead of the FAMAS and will stay ahead of the FAMAS from that point on. And this is the kind of things why you do calculations in both burst and sustain. And you kind of as well have to do it on a build because, of course, as we saw in the burst tables a second ago, it gives a skewed view because there it seems like the F2000 is all out beating the FAMAS on burst. So still, if we just need burst, if we just need that full-on burst output, a FAMAS is still fine, it seems. And if we move down to as well actually using fast hands, so this FH means fast hands here, we're taking the reloads on both of them to 1 second because both of them will actually reach that on average if you hit most of your shots. Then we see that the burst, of course, stays the same. Reload speed does not affect the percentages or the amounts of the burst DPS, so not these percentages don't move. But now actually the FAMAS is actually catching up to the F2000. So especially if you're using fast hands, FAMAS still seems fine because you're getting still a percentage of burst. You're losing 3% sustain. That at that point it's basically equal, but you can make a case for either one. Without it, I would definitely pick the F2000 really at this point, which is likely what I will change most of my weapons to. Then actually, if we add in Coyote at 15 to 25 and 0 to 15, because we kind of need to know both because they have different crit chance values as well, because we're flipping a mod, of course, from a 5% mod on the gear or on the weapon to a 6% mod on the gear, but we're also losing, of course, crit damage for that. So yeah, there is some value to doing both calculations here. On both of them, actually on the mid-range, we see that it actually separates a little bit between the FAMAS and the F2000. And this is actually the number I would look at. And this is close to 2%. It's 1.73% difference loss to the F2000. on burst, and then a 7% increase on the sustain for the F2000. This makes both weapons viable, really, to me. Even though the sustain is so much higher, this loss in burst on the position that will use it the most, which is in that 15 to 25 meters range, I would say, especially for ARs, is quite a big of a loss. Now, again, actually on 0 to 15, the F2000 actually gains more, and that is mostly down to, of course, it has its crit damage on the gear itself is actually lower, meaning that it gains more per crit damage gained, and of course it has 54 crit chance versus that 53, and while those are tiny differences, they add up here. Because it has less of a gap to fill in for the Coyote when it's 15 to 25 with that crit chance, but it then gains more from it when it actually is in the short range. So, but it never actually exceeds the FAMAS. So the FAMAS still has a place as the all-round, as the all-out burster. And of course, a lot of us are very comfortable recoil compensating for the FAMAS, so it'll always have a place, I feel. Moving on to as well adding in the Elmo, and especially adding in the Elmo, we'll mostly look at the second set of numbers, which includes the Coyote. So at this first one, we don't have the Coyote, this first set of numbers, and then the second set we do. They line up pretty evenly here, especially, and of course in sustain as well. The thing is here that I've done is this amp number at the end is actually strained on these weapons and specifically calculated for these builds. So how much of a percentage does strained add into these weapons? And strained is the top pick, even for the F2000 that has access to perfect Optimus. We'll go into actually a talent sheet after this one where I'll go into that. And of course, here is the thing that the Elmo doesn't have, which is that it can't have damage talent. So it is stuck with its talent, which is more of a utility talent, which still has utility. And then, of course, because of its 70 rounds and its better reload, it outsustains them still at every point. But of course, this is a point where, yeah, the burst is so much lower that the sustain being this much higher they basically even out between all three. So I feel these three are going to be the top contenders in the AR category for general use. And then for specific uses, especially flatline, then we go into other weapons as well. But yeah, I feel actually these three are kind of balanced. I still would say the F2000 should not be where it is here, just because the sustain is a little bit higher. And also the F2000 is much more stable weapon, much more easy to use. So I would say make this, yeah, plus 25, plus maybe like 7% weapon damage increase to its base and such. Put it a little bit lower than the FAMAS is where I would put it if I had the choice. Still competitive with it, but not to this extent, really. Although it's basically fine because the Elmo was already there anyway, so it's a moot point, really. I'd be okay with it going into the game as is. Next up is actually the interesting one where we have most of the contenders, all of the weapons that have been changed, missing out, of course, the ones that haven't been changed, really. The FAMAS and the F2000 are clearly at the top. We're using them here without a damage talent. That's as well why the Eagle and the Elmo are kind of poking out here. Of course, all of these other weapons could have a damage talent on top of them, and most of them would actually beat out the Elmo and Eagle, especially on burst. Here, I feel it's pretty... because the ACRs, G36, P416, and Mark 16 kind of have that, they all have the same 3 mod slots, so they kind of can be compared kind of in the same way as in the burst stables. Yeah, especially the ACR and the G36 look as the kind of seem as the standout weapon choices here. Both on their burst and their sustain, they're pretty good, especially the ACR being 97% of the FAMAS, but being 110% of its sustain is pretty like a worthwhile thing to look at. G36 having its burst speed that high, but then having the ability to have a long rail, at least on the enhanced and the military, that will make it likely between the ACR and the G36 upon what you like more, which one you like more for flatline, I would say, because M4 and Carbine, which I haven't put in here, they're falling way behind. And you kind of can see that in the burst tables already. The fall, even though it's moving up, and actually even on sustain, it seems to be doing decently well. That 40 round mag is still going to hurt it. It's kind of the same as the Mark 16 and the ACR now. I would definitely pick an ACR or Mark 16 over the fall as it currently stands. The CTAR only got a magazine size increase, and because of that, it doesn't really compete, but it is a very accurate weapon. So yeah, it is okay for it to be a little bit behind. Let's move on, and we'll basically actually, what you should do is only really compare the Elmo and the Eagle with each other, because these other ones, on top of the number of burst and sustain that they have here, they also get to have a talent. And especially, for instance, yeah, if you put just the 9.6 of the FAMAS, or even like with the Mark 16, actually, I know it's 11 somewhat percent with strained extra. We can see that at that point, the M16 with strained is beating both of these weapons outright. So you really need to look at those two separately, because we're not putting in damage talents for all of them, just for brevity here as well. So the Eagle versus the Elmo, the Eagle actually kind of wins out, even with its mag sizes, and that means that yeah, especially the Elmo, as actually I see, as I altered one thing and forgot to alter this back as I was kind of checking this out. But yeah, that's actually the numbers, because yeah, the Elmo, especially of course with the 70 rounds mag, as I altered it there to be back to that, as that was a mistake, but luckily I caught it before actually putting out the video. The Elmo, of course, outsustains everything with its 70 round mag. Although, of course, again, actually, if we put in this Mark 16 and put this 11% back in, that's already as well at 118%. So it doesn't go that far beyond the Mark 16. And yeah, Mark 16 is much easier to get as well, of course. Burst-wise, both of them compete. And really, this entire list I have here is kind of the recommended ARs list that will be going out for me, I feel, if the changes go in as are. The only one I would add onto this as well is actually the Chameleon, because actually the Chameleon, while not getting a buff, not getting any alterations to it specifically, what it is getting is that change that you can alter its third stat by reconfiguring it. Putting detox instead of the crit chance that it already has now actually makes it very viable, because it always was a little bit annoying to put it into regular builds, because you needed to make something specifically for it, because it had more crit chance than most other weapons, and it has a talent that then even adds even more crit chance. So instead of that, if we have the detox there, that already gives it a direct buff, really, comparing 10 detox versus the 9.5 crit chance. And that makes that weapon as well really viable. So it's basically this list plus Chameleon that will be pretty effective coming in next season if the changes go in as are now. Let's move on to a talent sheet that I put together where we are comparing the numbers for talents. And here we move on to a talent calculator. This is the reason that I'm recommending Strained with the F2000. We have the numbers here as it is from that build with 130 weapon damage, with the numbers as they are from the F2000 with its base weapon damages, and the stats of that build with Coyote set to 15 to 25. And we'll look actually in a second to one that has 0 to 25 or 0 to 15 for the Coyote. In this case, Strained wins against Perfect Optimist by a decent enough amount, which is a little less than 2%, 1.8%. And that means that Strained would still be my recommendation. And one of the reasons that Strained is actually pulling ahead is especially that 60 round max size. Because of that, Strained is pulling quite a bit ahead of Shield Splinter, which would be Perfect Optimist. Although, of course, getting Shield Splinter is, you can pretty consistently get it. It comes from the Hunters. You can just do the Hunters. It will take you like an hour, especially just the New York Hunters, or just the DC Hunters, which are much easier than the New York Hunters. You'll get it. You'll have it with a fixed talent. You can just put the damage to targets out of cover as it's stirred, and then you have it, instead of trying to farm for F2000, either free talentable or with strained already on it, so you can put detox on it. So there is a case to be made there, but just looking at what would be optimal, a strained actually still wins out, and by enough that if you are going to make a pick, I would pick actually strained over optimist. If this numbers was closer to each other, there is a difference between the two, even though they kind of work in similar ways. Strained does drop off if you stop firing for half of a second, where optimist doesn't. So optimist gets to retain its damage buff if you just stop shooting, and then you take more than half of a second to go to the next target and then start shooting again, which quite often does happen, meaning that if these numbers are close enough to each other, if there was less than a percentage point between them, I would actually pick Optimist at that point, because just for that extra usability that it has. But in this case, Strained still wins, although of course both are very much viable choices in this case. Although I would likely still pick Fast Hands, just because I enjoy Fast Hands a lot. We don't gain any burst, we gain a lot of sustain. This here as well is because, of course, in the case of Optimist, is very reliant on the amount of weapon damage that you have on the build. That's really what Optimist cares about. And especially in the new season, we'll get Expertise 25. So actually, if we put this to 155, simulating having Expertise 25 on there, then by a lot, Strained wins. And yeah, that's because it didn't alter anything about Strained. It's still at that 10.5% increase. But now Optimist has dropped off by quite a lot. And this is kind of the killer actually for Optimist, I feel, because yeah, even let's say instead of 25, you're just at 20 extra. Yeah, it's 2.5% difference between the two. And that's enough for me to choose Optimist or Strained over Optimist, and even Perfect Optimist in this case. Now, of course, it's quite different, especially in PvP, where I think actually, yeah, Shield Splinter will find a lot of use. It might become the new all-round usage in the DZ, because if you have only 40 weapon damage, which a lot of just all blue builds have, then yeah, then Optimist beats Strained by quite a large number. So yeah, there are reasons to pick it, but PvE full red is not it. Although of course, if you have a few blue cores, this balance shifts, but you can calculate this out for the build as you imagine it. So these talent calculators are of course always available, so you can just copy them to your own Google Drive and just run the numbers as you want them. But here I'm specifically looking at a full red, just going all out in damage. Although of course not going with the chest, we're not going with the chest striker, so there is that. But we're going with obliterate. So yeah. Moving on, I've done the same for the Mark 16, and this is kind of where that other number of 11% that I was using earlier kind of came from. This was me just trying to see as well, because of course one of the big things of it is that it has 60 round mag, even though it has a very high fire rate. This versus the highest buffed weapon with the lowest fire rate, which is the Mark 16 in this case, with again the Coyote to 15 to 25. But of course, the F2000 had a 60 round magazine and getting 10.5. This has a 50 round mag and a much lower RPM, which Strained mostly does care about a little bit. Although, well, it affects Optimist even stronger than that. Strained has moved up to 11% here. It is actually that 10%, that 10 mag extra is actually really strong for the F2000. Moving on to actually this third one, which is F2000 with a Coyote at 0 to 15, because that of course changes the balance between crit chance and crit damage. And of course the crit chance is dropping now, so less effectiveness for strained, but then strained is still winning. But if it was in this range, if you were considering it to be always in this range, I would pick Perfect Optimist at this point. They're within a percentage point of each other. And that means that I would pick Optimist at that point just because it retains between realigning your weapon. So where strain falls off, even if if you stop shooting for less or more than 0.5 seconds, Optimist doesn't. Optimist just retains unless you reload. So at this point, I would pick Optimist. But of course, this is not the range we'll most likely be using these kind of weapons, mostly because, yeah, we would drop, or if you're mostly in 0 to 15, you'll lean towards the Ouroboros or even an SMG. Let's move on to this last chart where we'll discuss Intimidate and Flatline. And I'll be pretty brief on these ones. As we said during the patch note, as listed here, although it's a little bit cut off, that changed somewhat the wording of Flatline, so we were concerned that it may have been altered. This is the calculations of a sheet. We've predicted numbers with Flatline as they are currently, as being a separate amp. These are the numbers from in PTS listed there. They match the current calculation still, meaning that it is a separate amp still. And that means that, yeah, nothing has changed there. It's just bad wording on their part, and they scared us. And yeah, we did test it, of course. And yeah, these numbers, so the predicted numbers, which are listed there, are matching the in-game numbers with it being a separate amp. If it was weapon damage, these numbers would be off by quite a lot. They're still off by a tiny amounts, but that's just rounding errors. We round, well, my calculators round quite a bit differently than the game does, and just for ease of use, because it would make them a lot more complex with a lot more actually logic behind it that I don't want to input into it, because close enough is good enough for me. But yeah, if this was moved to weapon damage, it would have not lined up as this. Next up is Intimidate, and we'll be brief there as well, just to round it out quickly. We have here just trying out to match Intimidate's number, and the only way we got it to match is to use 5% at 9 stacks. Even though that the patch notes say it's 4% at 9 stacks, which seems to have been their alteration. Although, of course, it's getting 3 stacks per second, so it's going to 3 seconds to charge up. Yeah, you need to use 5 stacks as your number, or 5% per stack as your number to actually match up. So it is still self-multiplicative, so it's 5% to the power of 9 to get to this number. And this is quite a high number. 55% is a lot. It is really a lot. And we also tested it as well, just to be safe. I wanted to test it with something that had total weapon damage, just in case it got moved in category. It was very unlikely, but I wanted to be certain. So we did try it out with, here the BK stands for Bloody Knuckles. We triggered Bloody Knuckles, triggering 25 total weapon damage, because, just to be clear as well, Bloody Knuckles, even though it says weapon damage, is actually total weapon damage. We've tested this in the past, so we know this to be true. It's additive to, for instance, Vigilance, and will give a matching number only if you have that. So here I was just testing to make sure it's not accidentally in total weapon damage, even though in most cases it wouldn't be aligning with total weapon damage anyway. So it wouldn't, as you won't have Vigilance plus Intimidate, really, because you'll be pairing it with Bloodsucker, or you'll be pairing it with Memento in real use. But just to be sure. And yeah, numbers wise, everything matches up to be that it is its own separate multiplier. And that it's also still self-multiplicative. So every stack of it is its own multiplier, meaning that it's multiplying against itself as well. One thing I then wanted to try out is actually how does this line up? Because the past Intimidate was actually less than having the chest of Heartbreaker going to 100 stacks. It was about the same, basically, because you would have two separate multipliers of 50 plus 40, 40 something, that the old 41, I believe, actually, the old self-multiplying buff of that one was. Here now, of course, it's much more than the 50% or the 50 that you would get going to the chest. And of course, it's a separate multiplier, so these two are also multiplying against each other. And I tried it out on the Heartbreaker Tech Tank, and especially as well to line it up in Cheska Intimidate versus Perfect Intimidate, because the Perfect Intimidate now has 10 stacks of 5 versus the normal having 9 stacks of 5. And is it worth giving up the brand bonus to get that Perfect Intimidate? In the case of Cheska, it very much isn't. I, at some point as well, actually briefly calculated versus Sokolov or Grupo. So if you have, for instance, a Cheska backpack with Bloodsucker and then a Grupo or Sokolov chest with Intimidate, in its current form, if in its current numbers, it is actually an increase if you're replacing a Grupo or Sokolov Intimidate with a Perfect Hunter or the Hunter Killer Perfect Intimidate. Just because, yeah, it just wins out. It replaces, it covers enough increase to cover against Grupo or Sokolov. Not so much against Cheska. Although, of course, it's build reliant. It depends on your weapon damages and such as well. But here, in the case of the Heartbreaker Tech Tank, it is a 16% increase going from the Heartbreaker chest to going instead to an Cheska Intimidate chest and then moving the fourth Heartbreaker piece out somewhere else. And yeah, this is quite an increase, although of course it's limited to 10 meters range. But there are a lot of places, for instance Summit, where a Heartbreaker Tech Tank can already kind of be in those ranges. And I feel this number is actually way too large. I feel they likely meant it to be 9 times the 4, which still actually lands on 51%, which is also still a lot. I think they need to reconsider this, make it either 9 times 3 or something, or actually, well, not so many repeating. So actually, one of the things with self-multipliers is the more stacks you add, it gets out of hand pretty quickly because it's multiplying against itself. So you're adding in more multipliers. Much more readily, I would say, move it to 6 stacks, 2 per second. You still have that same 3 seconds total, and then make it a number that matches, likely around 6% maybe or something. I haven't tried it out, but yeah, this 55% is a bit much. This beats Obliterate plus Vigilance by a lot, of course, and is reliable enough, especially with Bloodsucker, with Memento to get going, that, yeah, this is a bit much. I would hope for them to reconsider and rebalance this to not be as high. Although, yeah, because especially I could see use cases, especially in coordinated groups, where this could be very strong. And yeah, that kind of rounds out actually all of the things I wanted to ramble on about. We've gone on for way too long. I've actually re-recorded this as the first time I did this. It was way too long. But yeah, let's conclude this and move on. And to conclude this, the changes overall, I'm actually pretty happy with. I'm happy they're looking at the health, especially in performance and stability of the game. The game can very much use that. Some of the changes that they're proposing are not well thought out. Actually, well, to say it again, I don't like the open world loot scaling. But I understand it. I very much do why they're doing it. The gear lock and the scent rotation really should not be done. Same for the plus 20 to all LMGs, should really not be done. I hope they actually kind of look at the balancing and kind of reconsider how they're putting it together. The ARs as well could very much have a look at them and very much don't leave many weapons behind. That's what I would recommend. They are currently leaving a bunch of weapons behind. Bring them all up, make them in the same ranges for most of them, and I think the game will benefit from such a change. The gear rebalancing seems not very effective, but also I don't really see a good way for them to make it effective without adding to the power creep, because there is a lot of power creep in these updates. And one of the things I would love, and I've said this on stream many a times, is if they would also consider changing something on the other end of the equation, which is not giving just players more power, but also maybe heroic plus, legendary plus, making a mode above heroic, which isn't legendary, because legendary is not the same beast as heroic. It's quite a different change. And just doubling, for instance, all of the enemies' armor and health, giving us a little bit more difficulty by not being able to just kill them in all of their spawns. That would already actually be, I think, quite the good change as well. Because yeah, there has been a lot of power creep recently. Let's give the other side a little bit of love as well. But overall, I'm quite enjoyed my time on PTS. I will cover what they change, if any. And as well, I'll say here that, yeah, they broke a few things in incursions and such. Hopefully, those, of course, don't make it to live. People have been very vocal about them, but also keep in mind, it is PTS. Stuff will break. And yeah, I hope as well that some of the changes that they've put in, for instance, with the Doctor Home, also never make it to live servers. But I don't think they will. I very much assume that once feedback is given on those kind of things, that they'll stay on PTS and not make it to live. So yeah, that was it for this long rambling video. For my next video, we'll be going into the explosive builds and very much into, as actually I do have it here, I'll pull it up, sacrifice variant, and also the Tree Empress variant, which is much easier to put together, especially, of course, as Hollywood is currently active. But these builds are actually good all year round, especially in the right layout. And as well, we'll do the second part of the Cheska versus Grupo, which I actually wanted to tag onto the third weapon stats, but chose not to for length, as here as well, I'm rambling on for way too long. So yeah, I'll just leave it here and say thank you for watching. Hope you join me for future videos or over on Twitch, where I'm streaming quite often, and actually everything that has been shown to you today has actually been put together on stream in some form. So come hang out if these kind of things interest you. And as always, have a good night.